You're listening to a social justice podcast hosted by Nicola Spurling, brought to you by The Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book. Hello and welcome to a social justice podcast. I'm Nicola Spurling. I'm joined by Kishone Roy and Rebecca Love here. Kishone grew up in social housing across Canada, later spent a decade as a senior political advisor in BC and Ottawa, and has been working in and writing about affordable housing for the past decade. They're an author and affordable housing expert and use they/them pronouns. And Rebecca is my co-worker at the Flag Shop and a representative of the Vancouver Tenants Union. Rebecca uses she/her pronouns. She grew up in the Seas territory of the Choctaw First Nation before moving to the unceded ancestral territories of the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation. She's been a lifelong tenant, evicted once, and being evicted again soon. A social justice podcast is based off of a social justice coloring book. Every 2 weeks, we release new episodes focusing on various different social issues in our society. Thank you both for joining me today. Kishone, did you want to provide a little bit more of an introduction for yourself?
I just wanted to thank you for having me here, for one, and say that I ended up spending the past decade in housing, but social justice has always been important to me, and it's exciting to be part of a podcast that's focusing on it. And I remember in 2008, I worked for Stéphane Dion when we tried to form a coalition government with Jack Layton, and climate justice was central to what we were talking about then, and certainly housing. And we lost a decade on those issues when that government was never formed, even though it had the majority of the votes in the House. And I came back to BC not knowing where my place was and sort of finding some campaigns and working through it. And when I took a job in the nonprofit housing sector, there wasn't a big housing movement. It wasn't a big issue. So sometimes the things that are a major social justice issue today were in the past. Sometimes you just don't know, but you know in your heart what you're fighting for. And when it comes to something like housing, which we're going to focus on today, it's going to intersect with housing. Housing will intersect with transportation, with climate, with poverty, and with all kinds of other areas of social justice.
Absolutely. We hear this every episode. There's so much intersection between all of these issues that we talk about, and I'm sure it's going to come up repeatedly throughout this podcast as well. So this is just going to be a very basic question to start things off, because I always try to get a sense of what it is that we're talking about. So the first question is just, what does it mean for housing to be affordable?
So I wrote a book in 2017 about the affordable housing crisis in BC, and I used in that book the CMHC definition, which is about 30% of your gross income. And the truth is, though, that affordable housing is also if it's 25% of your income or 15% or 10%. And it doesn't need to specifically be co-op housing or social housing. There's the majority of people who are in the lowest income brackets and who are housed affordably it's in the private market. So affordable housing is a broad term, but when somebody is spending far more than 30% of their income on just basic shelter, all of the other aspects of their life start getting clawed back because there's no disposable income anymore. So you end up with people's health deteriorating. I met a couple once in Kitsilano who were spending 100% of their income on rent.
Wow.
So, some of this talk about affordability is really not about any specific person, but more like a warning signal to society that the financialization of housing and the low incomes that people have right now is destroying lives. And so, people hear about affordable housing and they try and make it a math problem for themselves to solve. But if there's nothing available, there is no math that can solve it. There's a $375 shelter rate in BC right now. So if you're somebody with a disability, and I met somebody with Down syndrome, she was a self-advocate, and was saying I'm ready to live more independently than in this group home. My allowance from the government is $375 a month. what are my housing options? There is nothing. So we can talk about affordable housing as a statistic, but in truth, in much of British Columbia, it doesn't exist because we didn't build any rental housing at all for 30 years.
Right. And when you mention that percentage as well, one of the things that I always wonder about is, 30% of someone's income if they're making $100,000 is very different than 30% of someone's income if they're making $30,000. Would it maybe be better to look at the amount of expendable money people have after they pay for housing as opposed to using a percentage of their income to figure out what is affordable and what isn't?
Yeah, and the 30% measure wasn't always the measure. It had been 25 before that. And, governments could just keep increasing it. A lot of homeowners get approved with 42% of their income going towards their mortgage. So, yeah, it is arbitrary depending on how much income you have. But the reason why it's important to always consider income is because for people who truly need affordable housing, we have to know how much resources they have available from themselves, whether it's working at a job, part-time, full-time, whether it's from pensions, whether it's from disability. People have a collection of resources in their life. And for a large percentage of Canadians, 20-30% of people don't work at all. And it was still, as a society, everybody deserves the basic dignity of shelter. So we need to know general measures of what affordability is. And probably at 30%, that means somebody would have 70% of their income for other things if there was housing available.
Right. And I guess if you're addressing at the same time the underpayment of employees and the fact that a lot of people don't necessarily have a huge income, that's going to factor into that percentage. And
yeah, and in places like Vancouver, where rents have escalated exponentially over the past decade, really, and certainly in the past couple of years, they've gone up tremendously. In places like that, you can make an above average income and still not find affordable housing, not just because of shortage of supply, but also because incomes haven't kept up with the basic costs of living. Just nearby in Seattle, the minimum wage is probably close to $22 Canadian an hour. Now that's an hour's flight. So that has an effect throughout their whole state, and that's our neighboring state. So in Vancouver now, you have more Americans living here than any city in the world. And they're coming from somewhere right next door with much higher incomes because we haven't raised minimum wages. Our wages in the film sector and in the arts are too low, and we haven't built rental housing. So now the cost of the basic elements of shelter are getting so high that everybody feels like they're in a squeeze.
Right. And did you want to touch on that, Rebecca, what it means to have affordable housing?
One thing I do want to point out is that the city of Vancouver specifically has a different definition than other places.
Of what affordable is?
Yes, because someone, I can't remember which politician it was, it said affordable housing is housing you can afford, comma, duh, which is not very useful. They consider it affordable if it costs less than buying a place. So obviously that's going to trickle down and make things much worse with new developments if that's your standard. Because obviously if you can't afford a $2 million house, okay, that's true for most people who aren't in the real estate ladder, but that doesn't mean that you can also afford, $5,000 in rent.
Right, absolutely. I think I heard a Vancouver councillor at one point saying that a 1-bedroom, 1-bath for over $2,000 was affordable, and I kind of thought, not really.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a good chance to touch on what the difference between affordable housing and below market housing is. Is below market housing affordable? Or
not in this market. I mean, below market, that can mean anything. If your average rent for a place is $2,000, then completely lost my train of thought. What was the question?
Well, I mean, let's use that example of $2,000. If you have a $2,000 place, I mean, in theory, $1,900 might be considered below market,
Right.
but is
Nope.
$1,900
Yes,
actually
that's what I was-
affordable,
yes,
right?
that's where I was going. Thank you.
Yeah. Did you want to touch on that as well?
Yeah, well, if $2,000 is your rent, then 30%. So you're probably, if that's 30% of your gross income, then you're probably making $6,000 a month plus, so $72,000 a year or so. So that's above the average household income, right? So if that's what a single person can afford, that's fine on their individual case. But by no measure is it, part of our affordable housing. It's market housing is what it is. It's somebody making profit on it and somebody happy to pay the rent to live there. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. We need more of it. Should have been building it for a long time. But where we have a huge gap too is in non-market housing, social housing, co-ops in particular, have become almost the only option for people in the lowest income bracket now, because the rental housing sector just didn't build anything for decades and decades, and the stuff that they're building now isn't affordable. And in BC, we're starting to have a renaissance of our non-market housing stock for the first time in a very long time. But it takes 10 years for an apartment to be built. So these investments we're making now might not be helping anybody immediately. And that's one of the really big challenges of working in housing, is especially coming from politics where everybody thinks in 4-year cycles. In housing, people tend to think in 25 and 50-year mortgages and 10-year building plans. And even our affordable housing plan for the province, I used to chair BC's Rental Housing Coalition. We tried to calculate what it would cost and pitch things out over 10 years, but you can only really ramp the sector up over those 10 years. From the idea of, so we saw the federal government and the provincial government put out funding for the first time in decades for new social housing to be built. But it takes them a year or two to put the legislation together and to the Treasury Board to pass the things to get the money through the budget. Then they have to create a program for everybody to apply to, and that takes another year. And then they've got to go through a process where they choose which projects go forward. So you might be, and we're 5-6 years here into new Democrat and Liberal governments provincially and federally, and we're just starting to see housing projects break ground on some project, in many cases, and in many cases they're still just waiting for approval. So it's very, very slow work, and yet everybody is passionate about it on a day-to-day basis. So it's a real difficult public policy issue.
And do you think that those delays are the reason that the renter's rebate, for instance, hasn't come to fruition yet? Because it seems like that's one of those measures that could be implemented more quickly, perhaps. But
it could have been implemented years and years and years ago. It is because of a systemic discrimination against renters throughout our whole government systems that things like this do not exist. In our property tax system right now, if you're a homeowner, you get a grant every year. Grant means free money. I used to own a home, couple homes, different stages in my life, and you click a button on the internet and the taxes disappear. Now, there's nothing like that for renters, right? And if you are unsheltered, if you are currently without a home, the government takes $375 a month away from you the second you lose your home. So we have a broken system here that's full of discrimination, and they don't see it as discrimination. They see it as like supporting the entrenched interests of the people who built this city. But what that means is that homeowners are receiving subsidy after subsidy after subsidy, and renters pay more property taxes, and they pay for their parking more often, and receive no grants and subsidies from government whatsoever. So, renters aren't allowed to serve in the Senate. There's no reason for that. You have to own land to be a public official in Canada. But we have a lot of systemic a lot of this bias was brought in to discriminate against Indigenous people in particular, because they wanted to because they passed laws saying that if you were First Nation, Métis, you couldn't own land at all. So being a landowner was sort of in a very legal sense, a sign that you were part of the upper echelon of society, and the upper house is only for landowners. This isn't part of our modern society now, in theory, but in law it is.
Right.
And so what you have is whole city councils, whole bureaucracies, whole cabinets, where everybody is a homeowner. Nobody is looking at through the lens of them as a renter. And when they do, it's like, well, my kid's looking for a place now and can't find it. Yeah, because we didn't build it for 30 years. Or, geez, there's nothing for me to downsize into. There's these problems of convenience, but they don't see the systemic bias in favor of the rich that's been hardwired into almost every area of our political system.
It sounds a lot like that concept of trickle-down economics, of just giving so much to the people at the top and hoping it'll somehow help the people at the bottom without really recognizing that that's not how things work.
It certainly doesn't work in housing.
Right.
There may be some fields where you can make the case. Maybe scientific research, I think you want to give people with the capacity, the funds to do the research. You can't just give every scientist $1,000 and see what happens, right? But in housing, if the people who are using the housing, the renters and the owners, if they have the money to do it, then it will be created to serve them. You can't just give the money to landlords and hope for the best. You can't just give the money to developers and hope for the best. There has to be much more individual liberty in housing, because every single unit is an entire life.
Well, I guess this is probably a good time for me to be transparent and say I am a landlord. And I've noticed this aspect of landlords thinking that they deserve to make immediate profits off of their properties. So this idea that you buy a property, you rent it out, and immediately you're making profits. But you're not only making immediate profits, you're also paying off your mortgage, and at the same time your property values are going up. So you're making profits in so many different areas. It seems very predatory. So in my instance, I decided to lower the rent. I lose money every month in order to give my tenants a below market rent. Whether or not it's affordable for them, I'm not entirely sure, but it's lower than other units in my building. And I'm still going to end up probably making a profit on it in the future, because the property values have gone up, and because part of that money that I'm bringing in is helping me to pay off the mortgage. So I don't think there's a need for pricing to be this high. I think there's a huge component of that is just landlords trying to be greedy and make their profits at every level.
Yeah, I think any landlord who complains, especially one who says something like, I've owned this place 10 years, you need to also tell us what you paid for it and what its current assessment is before anyone is going to feel bad.
Right.
Because either housing or, investment housing is an investment, and therefore you take your wins and your losses, or it's a human right, and therefore it's accessible to everyone.
And that's actually one of my other questions. Is housing a human right?
I mean, it should be.
It should be.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I was in Quito, Ecuador at a UN conference called Habitat 3, where Canada signed on to housing as a human right internationally. And they shouldn't have had to, because housing was a right in Canada when I grew up. And I grew up across this whole country. And I remember I grew up in a family not only in social housing, but always just at the margins. My mother is in the foster care system and has a disability. And her family were always kind of in and out of challenging situations. And we should have seen homelessness within our family then, but we knew if we lined up at the social services office and we would eventually either get some temporary support or there would be a room somewhere for us. So there was a lot more resourcefulness in government to be able to find that for people, because we believed everybody has a right to shelter. It was so obvious. But then you read your Charter of Rights and you're like, oh, doesn't really mention housing in here. But now Canada has signed off on it. So it's the obligation of all of us as just members of this democracy, because government isn't separate from us. It's us, whether we like it or not. We made it. We're in charge of it through our votes. And we have the ability to either, work in it or run for office. So it's still ours. And we now have to realize that, right? I remember when gay marriage was legalized, I had some friends who were older, and I thought they would be so happy finally that they were able to be married, and they immediately, well, no, that's for the younger people. It's not for us, right? And so people had to actually get married. Gay people had to get married for there to be gay marriage. Somebody has to take the right. It's not just a law that's passed and things happen. And for the right to housing, yes, it is a right, but it's a right we have yet to secure. That's why there's now a national housing advocate to focus on a human rights-based approach to realizing the right to housing. It's now like a mission in front of us as Canadians and to a larger extent internationally, because I don't think we're the only country wrestling with this for a while, right now. For a long time, the world was very, very focused on getting high home ownership numbers in their country, and it sort of lost sight of everything else going on. And they hadn't thought about a right to housing in a substantial way. And while landlords may seem greedy today for trying to get a rent and a profit on their place, the bigger problem is that we don't have more landlords, that there aren't tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions more units of rental housing across Canada right now. We should have been building them. And instead, what we did is we took homes that were 1,700 square feet and made them 2,700 square feet. Detached homes, now 80% of the residential land in Vancouver is zoned only for those. So apartments aren't even legal to build. So we still have a lot of work to do to realize that right to housing, because you can't even legally build affordable housing right now. It's banned by zoning.
Right. And I don't think the issue is necessarily the greedy landlords themselves. I think that's sort of a symptom of the issue and a lack of proper regulation of housing. But who do you think is most in need of affordable housing?
Everyone who does not have a house right now. So the Hastings encampments, the crowd park encampments, the people right above that who technically have a home in the SROs that keep burning. We've got to take, if we can fix the bottom of the market, we can fix everything else. If you lift from the bottom, it will flow upward.
So starting with the people who have no homes,
yes,
getting them homes, and then sort of working your way up.
They should be the number one priority for every single city, province, and for this entire country right now. It's a travesty what's happening. It's not right. And they are the number one priority for really no government figure at all that I'm aware of right now. And it doesn't make any sense to me because right now across Canada, governments are now pulling in multi-billion-dollar surpluses. But if we as a society made $1 billion in surplus and some of us had to sleep outside, who paid for that surplus?
Yeah.
Because the truth is that we are taking advantage of people when we leave them without our basic supports. How are we taking advantage of them? Well, homeowners, businesses, even individuals all received all kinds of subsidies through COVID and receive all kinds of subsidies through our initiatives to green our economy. There's all kinds of benefits for carbon taxes and everything else. Yet the people who are taking the least amount of out from the system, getting no grants at all, and who are producing the lowest emissions are left suffering the most. And in many cases, there are all kinds of other health issues there that aren't being covered. And we've been negligent as a society. I don't know when we crossed that line where we decided all of a sudden that some people who are wealthier deserving of subsidies and people who are without, we're going to call the cops on them, or we're going to ignore them, or we're going to talk about them like they're them and not us. But we've crossed it. And Social Justice Podcast here, I think about Martin Luther King Jr. and near the end of his life before his assassination, housing had become his great passion. And the housing justice and fairness acts that were passed after his death in the United States were transformational and were a continuation of his legacy. But part of his pain in that area came from moving up from the South into the cities and seeing the slums. Mm. And I wonder sometime if MLK Jr. was to come here today, what would he say and what would he think? And we could show him our slums, but we could also show him that we don't even have slums anymore to offer people. Yeah. So we have become so negligent about the people who need our help the most. And sometimes I'm not sure what the path towards fixing it is, other than hoping that there are some individual leaders out there who use the powers of their office to push through change for people who have nobody speaking for them. Because the shelter rate is a very good example. And for people who are listening, if you're on income assistance or on welfare in BC, you get $375 a month for shelter. That's not enough to rent anything today, anywhere in the province. Worse than that, if you lose your shelter, the government takes that away from you as well and leaves you on the street. It's a broken system here. So I've mentioned this in my book. I've talked about it with cabinet ministers. I've talked about it on stage in front of thousands of people, and sometimes in direct messages with cabinet ministers. And it's now 15 years and there hasn't been a dime of change. Every other thing, even the minimum wage goes up a little bit now. All kinds of other funds are indexed. Yet for those who truly are getting the least, why do we twist the screws on them the hardest? It makes no sense. And I'm waiting for somebody who wants to be premier, who wants to be mayor, who wants to be finance minister, anybody who wants to be prime minister, to point out this injustice and to say, you know what, this is going to be my number one priority, because you could raise that shelter rate tomorrow. Tomorrow, it's just one digit on the books. And a few years ago, there was a story I was involved in about mansions that were empty. And I had found about 800 of them across the lower mainland that were renting per bedroom, less than $700 a month per bedroom. Wow. On average. So you'd maybe see a 8-bedroom mansion renting for $5,000 a month, right? Mm-hmm. Now that was happening during the same week as our homeless count here. And there was about 4,000 or 5,000 people that were counted in that particular count, and far more empty bedrooms in mansions. Shelter beds cost $2,000 a month plus for the taxpayer to provide that. And meanwhile, we rent out mansions for less than that, and we let all kinds of things sit empty. There's no logic to the way we do things. And when that came out, another thing really clicked for me, and that's that Burnaby has about $1 billion in surplus as a city. And I'm not pointing a finger here at Burnaby. I'm pointing a finger at $1 billion, because I think people have forgotten how much money that is. We had $1 billion surplus here provincially, goes by, nobody noticed. Oh, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Mm-hmm. $1 billion is enough to pay for the shelter of everybody who's unsheltered in the whole lower mainland for 20 years, just on the interest, without spending your $1 billion. Just your interest, you could do this. So, I don't know that governments, that bureaucracies or politicians want people in need to have that money. I think they don't. I think they believe that their government systems are better, that they'd rather social programs that they'd rather put it into construction. You can't squeeze a dime out for people in deep need in this province, and it's sickening.
Well, one of the expressions that comes to mind is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I've seen studies that show that if you just give people shelter, you cost society less overall, whether it be because of the savings in healthcare expenses or crime or whatever the issue is, because when people have no money, they have to resort to all sorts of things that are healthy or that cost society a lot of money. So if you just put a roof over people's heads, it actually doesn't cost you anymore.
No, it saves you a tremendous amount of money. And I think we have been spending so much of our money as a society treating the symptoms of homelessness. And, for climate activists, that may ring true too. We're spending a whole bunch of money treating these symptoms and not the root causes. And when it comes to housing, one of the root causes is the supply. We do need to actually construct it, and that is going to cost billions of dollars. But I remember in 2018, the federal government, it's not that long ago, it's only 4 years ago, the federal government launched their national housing strategy. And I introduced the minister at that, and it was just nearby here, just a few blocks away. And it was $45 billion at the time. It's now over 80. And then I walked over the Burrard Street Bridge to go home. And underneath the bridge, in the rain, as the mud poured, were hundreds of tents, maybe dozens, but it felt like hundreds. And there was this really difficult disconnect for me, whereas on one hand, you were with a minister who was saying, hey, here's $45 billion, we're going to help people in need. And then you walk over the bridge and you say, I don't know how long it's going to take for them to see any of that money. And many people might die waiting. Mm-hmm. And here we are 4 years later, and I don't know that the money's reached people.
Right.
It hasn't gotten there yet. I don't know the right words to say it, because it should have been, there's 3 areas of housing that you need to focus on. One of them is supply. And another is policy, such as legalizing it. Mm-hmm. But another is income. And the incomes never got there. And the supply still way behind. Mm-hmm. And the policies are being debated at city halls.
Yeah, I mean, money definitely doesn't go as far these days as it used to. When I bought my place in 2013 even, I was making minimum wage when I bought it. And wow. You can't do that anymore. Not even just where I live in Coquitlam, but anywhere in BC.
Yeah, and you should be able to. And look, I think housing prices are going to start dropping quite dramatically over the next little bit here as interest rates climb. It has to. Mathematically, you just can't borrow as much at the higher interest rates. So what should happen, and this is just theory, but as housing prices start to come down, you will see some renters who've been waiting to buy start to purchase, and you will see people downsize into places so that they don't have to carry their big mortgages. And as the new supply of rental housing that we are constructing does slowly start to open up, we should see our vacancy rates creep up. Mm-hmm. And then landlords will probably start offering incentives, such as a free month's rent, or we'll pay for your move, or something like this. And then you may see rents come down. But I think we're still a long way off that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we saw some of that at the beginning of the pandemic, where a lot of students were moving out and vacancies were finally opening up. And instead of dropping rents, it was incentives rather than that.
Yeah, and I'm not certain that it's bad if rents are going up, if incomes are going up as well. But if government is going to freeze incomes like they have for people on income assistance, that's a government freeze for 15 years, right? So you're going to freeze income but allow rent increases? Yeah. Well, the math is never going to work out.
Mm-hmm. And I think this might be a good time to talk about the fact that we are recording this in Vancouver. So a lot of the topics that we're discussing are sort of Vancouver related or BC or Canada related. But I want to bring up one specific to Vancouver, which was in the news recently, where the VPD were attacking homeless people in the downtown east side. And it seems like the focus in all of that is moving the problem, getting it out of sight, rather than actually fixing it. So what should the city be doing to approach that situation in a better way?
I mean, if nothing else, leave people alone. This is setting up those street camps. That's their resilience. That's them coming together, forming a community, and just trying to stay alive, basically. Putting cops into the mix, it never goes well. There's no point. I mean, I sympathize with the fire department, who is worried about all the fires down there, because we just had another one today. But at the same time, you can do that without the police getting involved.
It seems kind of similar to that point that you made earlier about how there are no slums. That we don't even have that as an option, because when people try to set up camps like that, they get removed.
Yeah, and look, first thing I'll make clear is that policing isn't a solution to homelessness. If it was, I would let people know. I've researched the issue, I've looked into it. There's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that policing helps affordable housing. The number one most important housing issue for the city is a number of buildings that are high flood and fire risk, that are deteriorating. And a huge percentage of them, maybe half, are owned by the province. So we as a people, as a public, own these buildings that are a risk for fire, that are at the front lines of crisis regularly right now in affordable housing. And look, the whole stock throughout the east side of Vancouver needs to be reinvigorated. I happen to be of the mind that the best way to do that is to build a SkyTrain line connecting the PNE, like was proposed by TransLink. I think particularly if we're going to be hosting an Olympics in Vancouver and having the medal ceremony at the PNE, then a Hastings SkyTrain line makes tremendous amount of sense to me. I also think it would bring in billions of dollars of public investment, nonprofit investment, and private investment into the corridor. It's also the least safe street, Hastings Street, in the city for pedestrians. So there's a whole bunch of issues around climate and social justice and housing and policing. As far as I can tell, it's probably close to $1 billion is going to be required to be invested in the SRO stock in Vancouver from all levels of government, probably over the course of 10, 15 years. But there is no plan on which buildings are going to be rehabilitated when, on where people can move to, on what can be saved and what needs to be really closed down because it's too much of a risk. But I have no sense that police can solve any of this. The BC provincial government should be paying for all of this right away because they own the buildings and because their responsibility for housing and for health.
They have $16 billion to spend on a dam, so you'd think
the BC government last year predicted they would have a $10 billion deficit, and now we're here with $1 billion surplus. So that's $11 billion more than they expected. The Auditor General says that BC is keeping their books in such a way that all of money that's coming from the federal government, they're kind of pushing it off to future years and not recognizing it. So they're sitting on billions of dollars a year, according to generally accepted accounting principles, that they're not reflecting. Mm-hmm. We are in maybe the richest city in the continent. Certainly it's becoming that on average. It's becoming the most expensive, but it's also extremely wealthy. This province is very wealthy. This country is very wealthy. It shouldn't be a problem for them. It should be a rounding error for them to provide the basic necessities of life. And they should see immediate benefit in job creation and lower policing costs and lower healthcare costs by making these investments. They're not right now. There's sort of a systemic conservatism and us towards austerity. So governments will always, instead of doing the right thing, preach to you about the fear of some scary thing that's going to happen That if they don't do things exactly the way they're doing them now, then that scary thing is going to happen. And that is superstition. In real life, you have a very rich, wealthy place with all the resources and all of the public support to do the right thing. And sitting on your hands because you're trying to kowtow to conservative sentiment wouldn't even work for conservative voters. Because frankly, I don't think conservative voters believe that homelessness should be a thing in Canada. My mother grew up my mother raised us in social housing that was built during the Brian Mulroney era. And she'll probably always vote for conservatives because when she was, a teenager and had 2 kids and her husband left and had nothing, it was a conservative MP's office that she went to that helped her find social housing. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's a partisan issue. I think austerity is one of these things that's kind of become systemic and fear-based. And I don't know who's going to be the person to break that. But among the forefront are researchers in the United States. And you mentioned the increases to minimum wage. Part of that happened because great researchers were able to prove that whole myth that if you raise the minimum wage, it would hurt business was actually a lie. Mm-hmm. But people just believed it because it was good talking points for years and years and years. And it's the same sort of thing with policing, right? You'll see people running for office right now, and they'll ask, what are you going to do about homelessness? And they'll say, I'm going to hire 100 police officers. Well, 100 police officers, how about 100 construction workers? How about 100 nurses? I think it might feel good for some voters to connect policing and homelessness. It might just feel good to talk about. But I gotta tell you, I've worked in the sector for so long and I just never seen policing involved in housing at all.
No, I mean, that's not where my mind would go at all.
Yeah, how about a couple $100? That'd probably be solving it for most people. Yeah. I met somebody who lives in a boat, under a boat, in a boat here on the inlet, and he's 6'9", and he's a veteran. And so he doesn't fit in a shelter bed. He's too long for it. And being in those crowded spaces brings back his PTSD from 2 tours. And he just needs some private space. And so he knows he can get a boat for about $800 and kind of crash in it. Mm-hmm. And it'll last him for a couple of months, maybe a year, before, it might break apart or he's got to find something else. And this is his lifestyle here. Mm-hmm. I met somebody. Now, that person for $375 a month isn't being offered dignity. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't even have enough to pay a moorage fee for a boat. Somebody else, a couple I met, rented a plot of land for $300. So they could afford it on their pensions, seniors who had been homeless, and they'd built a shelter from a Rona shed, but needed $1,500 to get their toilet hookup. Mm. Now, they don't need social housing. They don't even need $375 a month, but $1,500 to get a little water hookup. There's a lot of homeowners, too, that could make rooms available in their homes for people who need shelter, for students, for workers, for people who are homeless, for women fleeing violence. If they had a little bit of money to fix up the place or for insurance or things like this. But there's no programs like this. Mm-hmm. There's massive government, bureaucratic programs, or you're sleeping on the street.
Yeah, and even that is so challenging. I was in Victoria, and I have a van with a bed in the back. So when I go traveling, I often just pull over on the side of the road, and I sleep in my van on the bed. I was in Victoria. I pulled off to the side of the road. I try to find somewhere that, is nice and deserted, so I'm not bothering anyone. So I'm on the side of this road. There's barely a house in sight. Wasn't making a single peep, and yet I still had the police called on me. Oh. So, I mean, I was imagining in that moment, if I was homeless or houseless in that city, how would I survive if I'm getting the police called on me in that like ideal situation?
Yeah. It's funny because, we're the West Coast here and we're supposed to be so cool and chill, and we've lost that. Like, people are calling cops on each other over everything these days. It's ridiculous. Like, seriously, just let somebody sleep.
Yeah.
Right now, it's about $30 a night to rent a campsite in BC. So government shelter rate is $375 a month. Is about enough for about 10 nights of a campsite. If you have a credit card, which they won't probably give you if you're on income assistance. So the government knows what the deal is. They have land. They could shelter people on, or at least let people camp with some dignity. And instead they give them the finger and send them out in the streets. And in fact, they send them to these city hall meetings where basic human rights are being debated, and don't step in and do anything. And then,
well, and I think there's a role that municipalities can play in there too, because when I was over on Vancouver Island in the Victoria area, the reason I was sleeping on the street is that their rest areas don't allow you to stay there for more than an hour.
Yeah.
If you go to the rest areas up in, I think it was near Campbell River, there's people living in the rest areas.
Well, all over BC, there are far more tenting areas than near Vancouver, Victoria. And mobile home parks and RV parks. A lot of them in the Lower Mainland have been gobbled up over the past few years, manufactured home parks. This was a lot of affordable housing stock and a lot of transitional housing. And I've not, I mean that not in terms of people going through just a transition in their life, but going from place to place and figuring things out as well, right? That's been depleted. We kind of, for decades, built mansions and penthouses and shelters, and not much else. And we slowly saw the manufactured home parks get eaten up, and the affordable rental housing stock gets sold off to real estate investment trusts. And chip a chip, there's not much left. But it is totally reasonable, you're right, for cities to be able to offer some place to stay to people who want to camp or are forced to camp, or just want to try it out. It's just a reasonable and normal thing to do in a place like the West Coast.
It's actually something that Quesnel is looking into doing. Sorry, not Quesnel, it was Qualicum Beach. So they have people, I guess, quite often sleeping on the side of the road in their city. So I looked up their website when I was there to see if that was okay for me to stay on the side of the road. They didn't say yes or no, but they did say that they were working on getting a whole bunch of parking spots right down by the water, so that instead of having people, I guess, scattered around the city, sleeping in various areas, having residents call the police, they could just say, this is your area, park here, no problem, you've got a nice view, you're going to be safe, all of that. And obviously it's not an ideal solution, it's not providing people with homes, but at least they're taking some step, and it would be nice if other cities were doing that as well.
Yeah, and I think some cities can do a lot more, but some of them think they can do more than they actually can. We have a SkyTrain system. People can zip all around all the municipalities in the Lower Mainland. And so for some municipalities to not be building any affordable housing, and for some municipalities to be sort of saying that they can solve this problem, neither is really true. These problems aren't just local and aren't just regional, aren't just provincial, aren't just national. They're international. And Canada wants to be a place that grows. Most of our setup in terms of our economic objectives are based on immigration. And culturally, that's also who we are and who we've been for a very long time. That's really compromised if we don't build affordable housing. I think maybe some people thought maybe we'd just bring in just rich people from all over the world. But, we ended up with a real worker shortage. Now we've come face to face with our future. And I get a tremendous amount of hope because for the first time in maybe my lifetime, maybe as far back as I can remember anyway, we have Indigenous governments as partners, maybe, the largest partner, but certainly equal partners in many of these deals. And local governments and provincial governments and federal governments, all not just saying stuff about housing, but all actually doing things, all actually at the table, all actually consistently, updating their proposals as elections go by. There's a lot of energy, and I think it's being driven by the public. I think the public's way ahead of the politicians on this issue. But a lot of justice will be served this decade in the area of housing. I do want to maybe ask Rebecca about the Vancouver Tenants Union, because I think that's one of the new things that's happened over the past 4 or 5 years is tenants have become housing activists. And when I was involved, I was CEO of the BC Nonprofit Housing Association, who are landlords. They run 60, 70,000 units of social housing around the province. And we were making the case that the housing was needed for tenants and prospective tenants. But we, with the exception of co-op members who've been very activists for a very long time and were very involved in the Housing Central movement, it didn't have the participation of tenants in a large way. And now I see renters at City Hall meetings regularly advocating for rental housing, pushing the envelope when it comes to the proposals that politicians are putting forward out there. Do you think tenants as a social movement is something that is growing and will be strong and sustainable for a long time here? Or is it just a reflection of the current, everybody's talking about it, so I'm going to get involved in the cause? Are you building something big?
We're trying to build something big. I mean, people keep joining because they're getting squeezed from every direction. We get so many emails. There's so much suffering out there. It used to be that when the Vancouver Tenants Union was first formed, we were trying to get involved in advocacy. We were trying to help people navigate their way through the residential tenancy board, things like that, and we were just burning out because the need was so huge.
Yeah.
So when we've kind of come back and regrouped, we're now working on organizing buildings. So someone reaches out to us and says, hey, my landlord does this, this, and this. It's not just me. There's other people in the building who have the same complaints. We go in. We talk to all the tenants. We try to bring them together. We try to identify the leaders in that group, and we get them to come together to make changes with their landlord, either through direct action. It usually starts with something as simple as everyone signs a letter together and then escalate from there. There's one building I've been working in near commercial that they reached out to us because the windows have been rotting out of the wall and their patio doors rot and fall on them, things like that. And nothing was being done because the landlord they're still paying $800 a month in rent, so there's no real incentive for the landlord to do much about it. So they've come together now, and we're hoping that they'll start their actions soon to get some change done. And they have gotten some already. They got their windows fixed, which was a big one. And now hopefully they can work on the mold and the pests and everything else that makes it close to unlivable. There's one set of tenants in there who have moved here from India for a better life, for jobs and opportunities like that. And they've moved to this building. They're like, we left India for this because it's just so abysmal.
So it's interesting that you bring that up, because in the building that I own a rental property in, I'm struggling so much trying to get the other landlords in the building to maintain the building properly.
Yes.
And we recently had an assessment where they said it was going to cost $1.7 to $2.2 million for us to basically fix the building and get it properly functioning. The studs are rotting out, all these kinds of things that are completely preventable if you do regular maintenance. But there's this idea, I guess, among a lot of the landlords that they can make higher short-term profits if they just don't do anything.
Yes.
And they don't think about the fact that you're losing value in the property if you don't, but you're also not treating your tenants well if you're not giving them a safe place to live.
Don't care about that. And you probably don't know this about me. I used to work in investment real estate, and that was a big thing. Like, my boss was like, I'm not going to replace a roof at 10 years when its life is up. I'm going to replace the roof when water is coming in everywhere, and it's a crisis at that point.
So it's not sort of a small issue. This is something that's quite prevalent.
Oh yes, it was extremely, because like I know the building I was just talking about. One reason the landlord won't do anything is because they're waiting their turn to redevelop. Because it's a 3-story right now. It can go up to 6 stories as part of the Grandview Woodland Plan. That's one reason I'm going to be evicted, because even though my place, which is lovely, it's probably 70 years old, but it's in great shape because they just renovated it 5 years ago, but then the big development sign of doom went up. They're going to tear it down and make a 6-story building instead.
Right. I know that happens quite a lot in Coquitlam, where I live as well, where they'll take a 3-story building and then approve a high-rise in that area. So the city will often say, we're creating affordable housing. We're going to give you this development, and yay us, we've got 4% affordable units in this building. Which then you kind of go, okay, 4% affordable units, like, well, what does that mean in terms of numbers? They're not actually affordable. They're just slightly below market.
Right.
And then you also compare that price of those below market units to the price of the units in the older building that was there previously, which is technically market.
Yeah.
But it's significantly less than the below market units that are going to be available in the new building.
Yeah, there was another similar development we got involved in, because it was like near Nanaimo and Hastings. The big problem was the tenants were being forced out, and the landlord was trying to appease them with the tenant rental protection policy, which is woefully inadequate in Vancouver. It should come from the province down and protect everyone, but it doesn't. They were paying about $1,000 in rent for a place that was falling apart. And the new place that's gone up, it was $3,700 for much smaller places.
Wow.
But the tenants had the right of first refusal coming back in, which was supposed to be like the perk of them getting turned out.
Right.
And this all comes back to this right to housing issue. Because right to housing doesn't mean you have the right to a specific unit at a certain price for your entire life. But it does mean that you have the right to housing that is adequate in your community. And we have a big gap there now, because my kids are just graduating high school. My eldest just started university, and nobody in the graduating class believes that they can graduate and get a degree and work in their community and live there as well. In fact, what kids are kind of taught these days is you have to go off to university, then go get rich in some other city, and when you have enough money, then you'll be welcome back to Vancouver. Mm-hmm. That's how we're raising our kids. And it's very, very weird way to build a community where you expect people to leave and, only come back if they're rich. That's very, very weird, and it's not sustainable, and it's not realistic either. People who live in Vancouver have a right to live in Vancouver, and we should want them and more of them here. Mm-hmm. Province-wide, immigration rates are rising, but people are also coming from other provinces around Canada, and I think on some level, BC should be a place where people come from across Canada to build a life. We have to accommodate all of that. That's the job of society and government. And what we missed was doing it for people at all different income levels. One of the failures of our social housing stock that we built in Canada through the 60s and 70s is in many of the developments, all of the rents are exactly the same. And all of the developments relied on ongoing government subsidy every single year. They're called operating agreements. And so you've got nonprofits or co-ops waiting for a government check every month to pay their bills, and everybody else who's living there paying an affordable rent, but it not being enough to maintain those buildings. So then, over the decades, not only does the building fall apart, but the whole economics of it are faulty. It'll never work out. So when we went through replanning out the social housing stock we'd like to see in BC, and what we're building now is we've gotten more into these mixed income models, so that you do have units that are at higher rents and lower rents and medium rents and different size units all in the same building. But they don't require ongoing government subsidy forever anymore. They can be completely self-financing in perpetuity. So we're going to see hundreds of years worth of affordable housing in BC that's being built by this generation right now. Probably over 100,000 units of it. And they'll be at a mix of incomes, which I think we need, because there's just a wide range of people who are just looking for security of tenure, just to know that they have a place that they're going to be able to bank on being there every night, so that they can go get a job or take care of their kids or have a tea or take care of a health issue. That security of tenure has really disappeared for people. They feel like, I could be evicted any day now. Our building could be demolished any day now. And the eviction rates in BC are so high compared to almost anywhere in the world. It's very, very high. It's become almost like a cultural, right? Like everybody talks about the number of times they've been evicted. That's really abnormal. We've got to get back to a place where renters who are paying almost all that they are making to feel empowered with that, to be able to say to you as a landlord, hey, fix my tap, it's leaking, right? This is a reasonable thing, or I'm out of here. Right now, renters feel supplicant to any whims, and they, have to line up for long, long times to even get a place, and that's just a broken. I mean, how do you tell anybody to invest here to build a business? How do you tell anybody who's coming to shoot a film or to reconnect with family or to immigrate that they should come here when we have a situation like this? It's really hard, and we want them all here, and we want to grow, but it's...
And you need that sort of working class of people, those lower income jobs, in order to make sure that your cities function. So to your point about saying, okay, well, just leave, go work somewhere else and come back. If you can't have a city that supports your lower income workers, then your city doesn't really operate. Yeah,
you need support for lower income workers, and you also 20% of people, 30% of people don't work or don't pay any taxes at all. It's still part of your society. If somebody is retired or a child or whatever, we've gotten, it's part of the financialization of housing, is we've looked at everything through this lens of, how much do you produce and what can you afford? Even if there was no money, we would still want to be able to shelter all of us. Even if we were pushed onto an island or in an emergency. Tim Richter, who's the head of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, was really taken by how quickly Alberta responded in an emergency through floods and fires to put sandbags up and to find housing for everybody. And he knows now that every government has the ability to do that right now for people who are unsheltered and choose not to. And so cities could get very, very active in putting together a housing first place where they had a by list registry of everybody who is unsheltered, and had done some basic triage to figure out who needed homes most and what neighborhoods were suitable for them, and had individuals who were helping them get there. But people don't even have navigators to help them navigate through the bureaucratic systems right now. And the major investments that need to happen into things like SROs aren't there. And I hope if somebody has a plan, but I don't think BC has an emergency housing plan. I've looked into it with the climate risks that are not just ahead, but the disasters we've already seen. You would think somebody would be coming up with an emergency plan, but we really don't have these things in place as a society yet. Maybe that just speaks to our immaturity.
Or maybe it speaks to those 4-year election cycles that you were referring to. And
I think that's part of it. Yeah, maybe.
It's a hard one to answer.
Yeah, I mean, it forces us to look at ourselves and say there's something wrong with us, that we say all of these things about wanting to take care of the most vulnerable. But when any of us are in positions of authority, we actually don't do it. And we all support lots of people of lots of political stripes, and they just don't do it. They just don't care enough. We don't care enough. It's not a they. It's we as a society don't care enough about homelessness. Because our politicians, whether you like them or not, they're reflections of us. You know, they're just looking for the talking points that poll well. They're trying to say the words back to us that we want to hear. And they're not coming out and saying we've failed. We've failed people who are unsheltered, and we're going to step up now and provide them the basic essentials of life. I mean, a minimum income would be reasonable to me. There's Canada's talking about a Canada disability benefit, which I think could help tremendously. But if provinces claw it back, provinces are so negligent in this country when it comes to the poor. I'd been making some TikToks and tweets about our shelter rate here. It's the same thing across the country. You know, I don't know how we just let 15 years pass and not give people a penny. It's disgusting. So I think something's wrong with us.
Yeah, I mean, I've been noticing it out campaigning with candidates in Coquitlam, for the upcoming municipal election. And one of the things that I noticed, it was a tweet by Justin McElroy, who laid out the shelters that are available in all of the cities around the Lower Mainland. And Vancouver's basically has the shelters for all of the Lower Mainland. None of the other cities are really pulling their weight. And we have one in Coquitlam called Gordon House, where almost every resident whose door you knock on will say that's a problem. It's not a good thing, it's a problem. They say it's bringing crime to the neighborhood. It's, we don't want to see that in our backyard sort of mentality. And for that reason, the political candidates don't talk about homelessness because they know it's not going to get them votes. They know the people on the door are going to say, no, we don't want more shelters here because it's going to bring the kind of people that we don't like to the city.
Well, to political candidates who are running in this election, I would say to them, grow up, be the adults in the room. Tell your society that you want to lead, that you have a job to do. And part of that job is to provide everybody with shelter. That you don't want to be a society where people have to sleep outside because you didn't make the hard decisions when the opportunity was in front of you, that you kowtowed to patience and instead of action. So Housing Central team is running a Make Housing Central campaign this municipal election. They'll be putting together 5 calls to action. Among them are going to be asking politicians to be very clear that they believe that social housing and rental housing needs to be legalized. I don't think shelters are the answer. I think we probably have too many of them. The cost of maintaining them is hundreds of millions of dollars a year, which we could be using to build affordable housing.
If the government wanted to house everyone, right? Because shelters to me seem like a stopgap measure, right? They're intended to be someone's in crisis, they find a shelter, then they find, a proper place to live. But if they don't have the piece of being able to find the proper place to live, they wind up just being stuck in a shelter. Well,
they don't only end up stuck, but the whole system ends up stuck. In my book, I called this stuckflation. The cost of everything is going up, but nobody is actually able to have any change in their life. And then so if you are a homeowner, the value of your house may have gone up, but you can't buy anything else in your neighborhood. You're kind of stuck, right? And if you own a townhouse, if you wanted to get a detached home, the gap between those had increased so much, you're kind of stuck in a townhouse. And you can't, if you were renting and wanted to be able to purchase, that gap, it went up faster than incomes did. And so you kind of ended up stuck renting. And I met people who would be renting a 2-bedroom and their roommate left, but the rent on their 2-bedroom, because it's rent controlled, is lower than what it would cost to rent a 1-bedroom on the market. So they end up overhoused and in a 2-bedroom when they only need a 1-bedroom, because if they move, then their whole economic situation collapses. And similarly, if somebody is unsheltered, the gap between that $375 and a market rental has become so large that they've ended up stuck. So in this area of massive wealth creation, where our province is pulling in billions and billions of dollars, particularly from housing, everybody has kind of become stuck, including seniors who, we designed a lot of our homes, a lot of our neighborhoods, with kind of a school at the center and detached homes around it, thinking that all those detached homes would be filled with 4 or 5 kids each, and then they would all fill the school up. But over the decades, what's happened is seniors have stayed in those homes, raised their kids in it. The kids have left or gone out to the burbs. And the population inside our city or around schools is so low that schools are facing closure in a massive growing city like Vancouver. Makes no sense at all, but it happens all over the world and all over North America because of poor city building, because of apartment bans, and because of this sort of mentality we had that we were going to mow over all of Canada and build mansions for everybody. It's ridiculous. And a lot of people don't even want to live that lifestyle anymore because you've got no shops nearby and no schools nearby and no transit. The new kind of developments that are being proposed are going to be more and more what I call smart housing. Sustainable means green, built to the best standards, mixed income, affordable rentals near transit. And I think more and more that's
communities.
What we're seeing the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh do at Senac is a very good example of that. I mean, that's going to have the highest walkability score around, and will be built to modern standards, and will be rental for decades and decades and decades. And I think if you look to what the co-op housing sector and the community land trust is doing now, and just at Hogan's Alley, I was so excited to hear today Dr. June Francis and others announcing that they're now ready for that Hogan's Alley to be moved to a community land trust. That means that housing will be not only existent, but affordable in perpetuity. That's a very special thing. Nobody's been doing that for us for the past few decades, building stuff that would be perpetually affordable. We're doing something unique on the West Coast here. I've not seen that kind of momentum across the country yet. And we're actually going to have to become the teachers, I think, on the continent. We're learning, I think, from other places, and we're trying things out here. But we're a few years ahead in terms of the funding and the building and the public support for things like this. But slowly, I think urbanism is replacing neoliberalism as the sort of center of thought in society. And so more and more people are thinking about things like housing and climate, transportation, basic mobility and equity issues, instead of just looking at everything through a financial lens.
Right. Well, it's a step in the right direction then. Yeah. Do you have any comments around the intersection that exists between reconciliation and housing affordability advocacy work, given that we're currently residing on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation?
And no displacement on stolen land, as we say. Hastings has a large Indigenous population, so failing that's just another thing that's an absolute failure down there.
I can't imagine reconciliation being possible while we still have mass homelessness. And the fact that Indigenous people are disproportionately represented in homeless counts shows me that this housing crisis is, is colonial in nature. Because you take people's land and complain about homelessness. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess I'm also wondering, so we're talking about trying to find people homes on someone else's land. Is there sort of a...
Oh, it's not someone else's. I mean, I don't think that's ever what First Nations have said, is that, this is ours and it's not yours. The problem has been Canadians and governments and settlers saying this is ours and not yours. That there is some separation and some difference. Every Indigenous nation I've interacted with in BC have put welcoming as like a hallmark of who they are as a people. And, these developments that are going up, MST is the largest developer now in Vancouver. They're not doing it to keep people off their land. They're trying to welcome as many people as possible.
Right.
And so I think, but I do think, the fact that they've chosen rental is significant. This is the largest rental housing proposal that I've seen in Canada. I mean, not only is it many thousands of units, but CMHC has now done the lending for it at $1.4 billion. It's the largest loan Canada's given out, and it's to Indigenous nations. So I think this is really, really important what's going on. And, it may not have been what I would have devised. I'm more of a nonprofit sort of person, but that's what's so beautiful about it, is it's Indigenous leadership in a modern way, leading the country, telling them this is where we're going. Are you with us? And I think it's going to be something that other nations all across Canada learn from and try and replicate.
In your work with VTU, what are some kinds of policies that you're trying to push for that would address this from the government side of things?
Mostly we oppose any kind of financialized housing, like across the board. There's been so little done on social housing that we feel that is like, that's what should be done first. I mean, we have limited resources. You work into construction, you know what the labor force is like.
Almost non-existent at the moment, or difficult to find people.
What materials cost. So
a lot, yeah.
We should, be using the few that we have to rebuild the bottom first before making more investment vehicles for more landlords.
Right. So before having those kinds of properties that people buy up and leave vacant or hang on to in whatever form so that they can profit off of them later. So kind of to that point then, if VTU doesn't believe that housing should be a commodity or something that's, I guess, profitable, does that stance recognize fair payment for things like trades work, building management?
Yes.
And does it also mean that the government should become landlords?
Well, not necessarily government. Government does need to invest, but at the same time, like the right to self-determined housing, like through co-ops, where the money that goes towards your rent is what's going towards keeping the place up. It's not going to someone else's bank account. It's for the whole community. We're looking to bring the community back in to help build communities, because that will alleviate so many other problems. I mean, there's a loneliness epidemic, and part of that is you can't feel safe in your community anymore because you never know when you're going to be displaced again.
Right. So the idea is to create more security and be able to reinvest the money that people are putting towards their housing back into their housing.
Right. Exactly. So, and there's a lot of labor union people in our union as well, and so yeah, we absolutely think that people should be paid for the work that they're doing. We absolutely 100%. But at the end of the day, it should all be a self-sustaining system and not someone skimming off the top as well.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds kind of like my personal philosophy to renting my place out is when I'm looking at the numbers, I don't want to be profiting off of an affordability crisis. I think I deserve to get paid for the construction work that I do on my place. I think I deserve to get paid for managing the place, but I don't think I deserve to get paid for sitting on my butt and doing nothing. Has your experience growing up in social housing led you to believe that that is a good solution to an affordability crisis? Like, should we be building more social housing?
Yeah, we shouldn't have stopped.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly didn't appreciate it when I was living in it. And I hid it for a lot of years. You know, I came out of a life in social housing and worked very hard to never think about it again. Mm-hmm. Became very active in politics and started walking in fancy circles and never kind of mentioned it. But as I got older, I realized that it forms this sort of essential connection for our whole social safety net. You know, it's the string that ties it all together in Canada, that you could have the best healthcare system and advanced climate programs and wonderful universities and colleges. You could be great social justice warriors. But if you do not have housing, if you cannot offer people a home, then everything else falls through the cracks. And human rights becomes a talking point instead of something you can actually deliver as a society. And when I started working in the housing sector, I hadn't realized too that the lived experience of growing up in social housing was a kind of expertise that none of my colleagues had had. So I would be touring around, going to different developments, and I would be like, I used to live there. Oh, my Aunt Shelley used to live over there. And, you know, I know these buildings, and I know what the rents are, and I know how the programs work. I remember working in a constituency office, and people would come in and ask for help with their cases, and I'd be like, oh, yeah, my mom used to use this program, and I know this, and you could call Betty over at the social services office. And, you know, that lived experience was extremely valuable for me in politics, and then as a leader in the housing movement here in BC, you find out that like housing executives are largely extremely wealthy, even in the nonprofit sector. Mm-hmm. You know, you'd be every night just people telling you about their acreages, and you know, to get to the top of any field, you probably pretty wealthy, but it meant that I had something that they all couldn't. There was a kind of learning that I had that they couldn't get.
Right, you're bringing those pieces together of that sort of being politically involved, connected to those people, but also having that experience that a lot of them don't have.
Yeah, so I would say to people listening to your podcast, whichever area of social justice they're passionate about, don't be afraid to feel confident that they have some lived experience, and talk about that like it's a credential, because it's just as good. It's, you know, I later got an advanced certificate in affordable housing with the Chartered Institute of Housing, and I'm pretty sure that lived experience being raised in social housing was more valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the podcast that we did on I'm trying to remember the topic, but it was on finances. And we try to have one guest who's an expert and another guest who has lived experience. And a lot of times there's overlap in there. But in this case, you have the financial advisor, and then you have the person with no finances, right? And so you've got one person who very much understands the inequities of finances because they're living it. And you have another person who is, you know, the expert, but probably isn't really the expert when it comes to that conversation that we were having. So, I think that lived experience is incredibly important when it comes to social justice advocacy work.
May I ask, was the social housing you grew up in, was it like adequate housing? Was it dignified?
Yeah, extremely.
Okay.
And part of that's because of my age. I'm 45 now, and so I was born in 76. And a lot of the housing that we would have moved into would have been in the early 1980s and 90s.
So it's fairly new back then.
They were mostly brand new.
Okay.
And because my mom, was extremely young with very young kids, we were often the first on the list to get into brand new social housing when it was built. My brother and I used to go into an empty place when we first moved in, and those little rubber balls, that big bounce. We would take them and just whip them around the place in these brand new empty buildings, and we were as proud as could be as anybody else. It's perfectly dignified, and in many cases, it's much better too than anything the market could deliver now.
Yeah.
There are townhouses all over Coquitlam that are social housing, and you couldn't build private market townhouses for less than $700,000-800,000, maybe over $1 million a unit now.
Mm-hmm.
And there's plenty of social housing for $300, $400, $500 a month that are now more deteriorated, but certainly large and dignified buildings. And there used to be a lot more flexibility, though, too, because sometimes a church would give they would have an old place and you would crash in the upstairs for a little while and stuff like that. It would sort of bounce around across the country.
You gave a presentation in 2016 where you stated that single mothers pay the biggest proportion of their income on rent. Is that still the case? Have the dynamics shifted a little bit?
Well, yeah, that was based on data from our rental housing index. And in fact, it was Coquitlam that stood out in that, where it was worst off in the province for single mothers. That was also my life experience, too, is not just my mother, but she had 5 sisters, and many of them ended up single mothers, including, my mother's mother. And it scares me right now. We're just starting to see in Canada children starting to be born into homelessness, which hasn't really been statistically significant or notable, and isn't yet, but we're just at the cusp now of this. And mothers, there's a systemic patriarchy to the way we deliver housing. And for many years, women weren't allowed to live on their own, weren't allowed to rent certain buildings, were considered their assets the same as their husbands, or they were considered assets of their husbands. So unpackaging all of this will take time. But in the meantime, we say mothers, but it's really like children that end up not having adequate food or housing that's anywhere near their school or basic stability. And so I don't know statistically how bad they are today. I suspect things have probably gotten worse rather than better.
Right.
If trends were to...
Seems like it's gotten worse across the board.
Yeah. So there's a few key groups in housing that I would say are the equity-seeking groups. So Indigenous are the largest percentage of people who are homeless. The fastest growing group of homeless people are seniors. One of the reasons I believe this is the case is many seniors were taught that if they saved up, they could live off the interest. It would be enough to pay their rent. But interest rates went down to 0, and all of their fixed incomes weren't really paying anything to them and have become depleted. And so you end up with many seniors. Seniors who owned ended up having a massive wealth creation beyond their wildest imagination. Seniors who rented are the fastest growing group of homeless people.
Right.
I think you have young adults who end up staying in their parents' places for many more years than they expect, or living on their own, paying almost all of their income to just food and rent. I think, it's quite ridiculous. But single mothers should, receive such enormous support from government, because you only have a few years where you can take a child and give them the opportunity to get through school. Mm-hmm. And it just, I went through maybe 12 schools by grade 12. I have to count, but it's probably close. Certainly that many homes. And I don't think that's good for anybody.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I got a great education that way. I was a pretty smart kid, but I barely graduated because I think part of it was just, society doesn't make a connection between kids and school and stability and food and in any sort of dignified way. Parents are kind of left on the lurch a bit on their own. And when you're a single person, it's a whole tremendous burden and part of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. Is there anything else that either of you want to bring up before we wrap things up? Or maybe give some ideas about what people who want to advocate for affordable housing can do?
For people who want to advocate for affordable housing, there are so many ways to do it. Vancouver Tenants Union is one way. Being involved with a nonprofit that provides housing is another way. Being active in a political party. All of the political parties are trying to shape and form their policies right now to speak to housing in a way that resonates with people. So I think there is an opportunity in all parties to make housing central to their platforms and issues and ways that they're going. But one thing I didn't foresee was seeing a whole generation of people who were passionate about housing and solving homelessness being forced to line up at City Hall meetings every single night, on the phone for hours and hours, on hold. I would suggest that all of them are so passionate and trying to do best for their society on probably the most important issue in their community.
Mm-hmm.
But these broken processes have to change. And just because you're a housing advocate does not mean that you shouldn't also be an advocate for reform, for democratic reform, for electoral reform, but for systemic reforms to the ways that we consult and interact with each other as a society, because many people who support the status quo do it by entrenching these long processes that prevent any action. And going through their processes just to prove how ridiculous they are is one way of going through life, but another is taking over governments and fixing these broken issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so don't be afraid as a housing advocate to become a councillor or a mayor or an MP or an MLA or a premier or a prime minister. Those are all jobs that might be there ahead of you. And I would say too, having watched climate activists in Canada spend many years making the case that the cause was emergent and immediate, and then watching both, after Gore in the United States and then Dion here in Canada, after both governments didn't happen, and climate action stopped for the better part of 15 years after that. I would say that very important to be on the outside and be a good advocate and to join all these associations. But at some point, I think you have to take charge and you have to be the government. And climate activists are largely still on the outside, but I think we're going to need them in government. I think we're going to need them to take on senior levels of responsibility in all kinds of areas of government, because it takes so long for housing and climate in particular. Emissions take a long time to come down. The systems that we're reliant on for oil are so systemic, and housing takes so long to build. For these two issues in particular, if you're passionate about them, don't believe that your place is always on the outside. It may be that you're needed on the inside, because the people on the inside don't know what they're doing because they haven't had to work on these issues before.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody in government has had to work on housing for 30 years. You think there's no expertise and no staff to work on it on the outside? It's even worse on the inside. They've been twiddling their thumbs. And climate is kind of similar.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Rebecca?
We're so far behind on housing that we're not going to build our way out anytime soon. And so protecting tenants and keeping people in their homes, keeping home keeping buildings maintained is central to that, so we don't end up making things even worse.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for joining me
Thank you,
today. It's been great meeting both of you. Well, not both of you. I work with Rebecca. It's been nice meeting you. And thank you both for being on the podcast. This has been a social justice podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Spurling. This conversation has been on housing affordability, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. You've been listening to a social justice podcast hosted by Nicola Spurling, brought to you by The Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book.